Good afternoon and welcome to today's McGill News Webcast, Unfriendly Skies, How Did Air Travel Become So Irritating? My name is Derek Cassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Thursday, May 9th, 2024. As the busy summer travel season quickly approaches, many of us are drawing up plans to book flights and jet off to our favorite destinations. But what misfortunes might greet us as we navigate our way through busy airports, cramped airplanes, and ever-changing regulations around pricing, airport security, and restrictions on carry-on luggage? A recent survey of airline passengers shows that more than one-third of travelers have had a flight experience so frustrating that they have vowed to never travel with that airline again. The most frequently cited irritants include lost luggage, hidden fees, canceled flights, and unfriendly flight crews. Joining me today to discuss these pain points and to help us understand how we reached this turbulent moment are two McGill professors who are close observers of the aviation industry. Let me introduce them. John Gradek is a faculty lecturer at McGill School of Continuing Studies and coordinator of the school's Aviation Management program. And Karl Moore is an associate professor of strategy and organization at McGill's Desautels Faculty of Management, as well as a longtime consultant to the airline industry. And in fact, both of our guests were invited to Ottawa last week to appear before the House of Commons Transportation Committee examining the state of airline competition in Canada. Fresh off of those testimonies, they are back here at McGill and with us today to help us make sense of some of the issues plaguing the aviation industry here in this country and around the world. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation. And if you are watching us live and have questions for either of our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. So gentlemen, before we jump into today's topic, I'd like to ask each of you if you could summarize for us how you became subject matter experts in commercial aviation, perhaps, in a minute or so, succinctly. Professor Gradek, do you want to start?
Just a minute, right? Okay, this could be a little tough. Yeah, so close to 50 years in aviation. Started off at my favorite airline, Air Canada, back in the mid-70s after I got my MBA. Spent 19 years at Air Canada in various roles in operations, planning, and marketing. Left to work with CP Rail, and then at the same time started to teach. So I've been involved in teaching since 1985. And so I've got myself into the hands of the media over the last few years as an individual that has an opinion about the industry and can provide some interesting stories about how the evolution of the Canadian aviation industry has gone, and to talk about, what the future state might be with some policy changes.
Well, sounds good. I'm sure you have lots of great insight to share with us over the next hour. Professor Moore, how about yourself? How did you get sort of involved in aviation as a topic of interest?
Well, I started working in the aviation industry about 28 years ago, and I was a prof at the Oxford Side Business School. I did a program with British Airways. Later, I did some work with Lufthansa. When I moved to Montreal, I did a 2-day course on being a change leader for 240 Air Canada senior managers, 20 at a time, back in 2011 and 12. Each had to present a major change challenge they're facing. So it gave me a great background into Air Canada, what they were facing. And then I have a national radio show, I interview CEOs. My students call it a podcast, but I think it's far cooler to have a national radio show, but I can't convince undergrads of that. And I interviewed the last 4 CEOs of WestJet, 4 CEOs of Air Canada, Air France twice, both Michael Deleuze and his father Michael's the CEO of Porter now. So I have done a lot of work, and also, like John, talked to the press a reasonable amount about it.
Great. So it sounds like we're in really good hands with the two of you. So let's jump into this touchy topic of aviation and the aviation industry. Professor Gradek, you wrote in a recent column that commercial aviation in Canada is in a, quote, state of shock. What did you mean by that? And how bad have things become in the last few years?
Oh, a state of shock is that, we've been seeing a number of carriers have financial difficulties over the last few years. Financial difficulties because of the lack of working capital, the lack of available cash. We're running an airline in Canada is not for the faint of heart. It is an expensive proposition. And what's the fastest way to make $1 million in the airline industry? Start with 10 million. And it really is, a sinkhole for working capital, and you have to spend years, literally years, to be able to build up your market share and your strength in the marketplace. So the chaos is that we have carriers that have started up. We have one that's failed in the last 90 days. We have another one that says is in pretty good shape, but we will let the traveling public decide. And we have the duopoly. We have the duopoly of Air Canada and WestJet, and we have Porter, sneaking up there in third place, trying to catch up to the other two. So it's a shrinking pile of competitors. And guess what? Prices are starting to scale up, and service is not getting any better. It's in fact getting worse. A report yesterday by JD Power had Air Canada and WestJet both trailing the other North American carriers when it comes to service in all classes of the airplane. So it's in chaos and it needs some help.
So, quick follow-up for you, Professor Gradek. The last time we had you on this webcast was, I think, 2 summers ago, right as the world was sort of emerging from the COVID pandemics. How have the sort of COVID lockdowns, which put the brakes on travel, air travel almost overnight, how has that impacted the way the industry is currently being run, and what effects are travelers feeling even 2-3 years outside of the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, when we had our session, it really was at the start of a return for air travel. Air travel in Canada was in fact locked down for months and months on end, and slowly came back based with a whole bunch of restrictions, which I won't even go through. But it was a very difficult point. In terms of the world of aviation, it was the worst calamity in financial calamity and operational calamity that the world has ever seen. It's worse than 9/11, worse than SARS. And the airline industry, for the most part, in everywhere else except Canada, had a lot of government support to maintain the infrastructure and to maintain the base of employees. In Canada, that help was late. And while the industry was waiting for government support, they took action to reduce their staffing levels. Air Canada dropped close to 20,000 people, WestJet close to 10,000 people. Porter shut down completely, laid off everybody. So that loss of staff, when traffic came back in 2022, the airline industry was short. Air traffic was short, airports were short, and customers were left hanging with lousy service, lost bags, delayed flights, canceled flights. And so it's taken them 2 years to get their act together, to get the staffing levels up to where they should be, to satisfy the demands of the traveling public. There remains the problem of experience, of training, and of making sure that the people they've hired and the remaining workforce are able to deliver to the expectations of the Canadian traveling public when it comes to service. And unfortunately, they're having a hard time delivering the service because they're stretched, they're overstretched, they're working hard. The airlines are pushing their staff pretty hard. And I think that the staff are pretty unhappy. So it's reflecting in the service they're giving our customers.
Right. So we'll talk a bit more about that, I'm sure. Professor Moore, thank you for joining us. So you and I know our friends connected on Facebook, on LinkedIn. So I know that you spend a lot of time in airports and on airplanes as part of your work here at McGill. So what has the experience been like for you the last few months as you navigate through the aviation gridlock, if you will? And how does this compare to how flying sort of used to be back in the day, or at least back before COVID?
Well, certainly where it's not as much fun as it used to be. Part of it is I used to be a frequent flyer and got to go to the lounge. Now I don't. So that makes it a little less enjoyable. It is something where it's just busier airports. As John has pointed out, more freight employees. The planes are full off, and what they call load level, the number of bums on seats, is very high. And there's a lot of flights which are 1 or 2 seats, if that, available, which makes it more demanding on the staff, makes it more demanding on everyone. And particularly in Canada's winter, a lot of people, including myself, don't put bags below anymore. So Derek, what I'm doing is I travel, other than when I travel to students this year to North Africa, I never take luggage to put underneath. The net result is a lot of other people, hopefully not myself, get carried away and bring too much stuff on board. And in the winter, we have coats and maybe boots and other things where it's a big scramble to get on board in order to put your bag in the place you want it to be. And a few times I've had my bag down there and I ask wave at someone, they pass it and kind of goes over by everybody's head. And, everybody's fairly polite about it, nice about it. But it's not as much fun to travel as it was in the past. And what I encourage Canadians to do is, hey, you're going somewhere warm in the winter. Focus on that you'll be in Hawaii in 7 hours. So it's irritating to get there, but it'll be great when you get there. So it's something where it's not as much fun as it used to be. Part of it is that I now charge you for a lot of things. So stuff that used to get for free. Now, I remember I got on a Iceland air flight, WOW air flight to Iceland. And the guy was a CEO, had lived in Montreal for a number of years. I actually knew him. But I remember I said to the flight attendant, I'd like some water. And she said, it'll be $5. And I said, I thought it was a human right under the UN. And she agreed it probably was, but she still wanted the $5. It would come out of her salary. So, I understand that was a reasonable response from her.
Wow.
So it's something where, because of the sheer demand, the number of people on the plane and the demands on the employees, things are a little bit not as enjoyable as in the past. That's for sure. Now, I took 48 students to Morocco and Cairo, McGill students and alumni, and we were hours late, and it was tough. That's for sure. On the other hand, we got to see the Great Pyramid and things like that. So that's part of the reward of travel. It's tiring, it's irritating at times, but that's what you keep in mind. At least that's what I do.
All right, so I'll definitely come back and revisit some of these specific points, but let me maybe just bring some historical context into this discussion, if I may. And if you'll indulge me, let's travel back in time a few decades. I really want to sort of understand a bit of the root of how we got here as an industry. So I remember going back to the 1980s and the 90s, this being a period of significant change in the airline industry. We had deregulation in the United States. Here in Canada, we had the privatization of Air Canada. And in theory, these initiatives were meant to sort of open the skies to more competition, lower prices, better service. So Professor Gradek, maybe a difficult question, but what happened instead? How did things go wrong?
Well, the marketplace decided that it was much more fun and more profitable if you basically look to minimize the impact that competition would have on you. And they're looking at trying to maximize the return on invested capital in the existing airlines and to the detriment of more competition. So competition, yes, we opened it up, unregulated, let the marketplace decide how much we pay and where airlines should fly. And guess what? We are a long, thin country, 5,000 kilometers from St. John's to Victoria. Most, 85% of the population live within 100 kilometers of the US border. So it's like a line right across the country, and we only got about 12 cities that have any significant population base to support, a jet fleet of aircraft by these carriers. So one, long distance to fly. Two, very few markets. Three, guess what? We have weather. We have nasty weather. So Canada, is a case where maybe we went through some deregulation in a marketplace that probably needs some type of oversight in terms of markets that are served, prices that are charged, and the level of competition that's in there. And so we need today, and that's what Karl and I were talking to Ottawa about last week, we need a way in which we can, in fact, promote competition in Canada, because right now the system is such that competition is not really as strong as it could be. Karl?
Professor Moore.
Yeah, John, I agree very much with John saying. Let me put my business professor hat metaphorically on. It's that these are businesses. John and I are old enough, maybe not you, Derek, to remember when Air Canada was owned by the government. But it was back under the late Brian Mulroney as Prime Minister in 1989 and went private. And he was following Margaret Thatcher with British Airways and kind of let government do what it's good at, let business do what it's good at. And so these are businesses. Jerry Schwartz, a billionaire from Onyx in Toronto, owns WestJet. The ownership of Air Canada is on the TSE. The Luce family and some other friends own Porter. So it's something where what we look at, and is it Flair, the one that's owned by a certain degree by a Florida investor who invests in aviation, are good at that. These people are there to make money. And it's just like most businesses are. We have a couche-tard downstairs and they're there to make money and provide a great service. But how they make money is providing good services that we want to buy. So I think people forget that airlines are not in it in Canada or much of the world to serve and to make things easier. They are to some degree, but they're there to make money. And that's something I think we somewhat lose sight of in some of the discussions we have.
Right. So let me ask you, Professor Gradek, I know when you were on this webcast 2 years ago, you talked a lot about the emergence of ultra low cost carriers, which are presumably also in the business of making money, but we're also offering, much lower prices than we're used to paying in Canada. And you talked about this being a potential pathway towards lower airline prices across the board. And yet since then, two of those airlines, Scoop and Lynx, have gone out of business, leaving, I think, Flair as the last of that breed. So I guess my question to you, Professor Gradek, is, why is Canada unable to sustain low-cost carriers like the ones we've seen emerge in the United States and Europe and parts of Asia? And what impact is this having on ticket prices?
Yeah, well, the big bugaboo we have in Canada, and Flair, and Lynx is just the latest casualty. We've gone through 10 airlines in the last 15 years that have come and gone. And so, Swoop was integrated within WestJet, because Swoop was WestJet's answer to competing with the ULCC markets, whether it's Flair or Lynx. And Swoop basically got reintegrated because WestJet said it doesn't make sense for us to fly, airplanes against our own product. So, Swoop was flying between Toronto and Calgary. So was WestJet. Swoop was flying at $150. WestJet was at $300, and they were competing against themselves. So that model didn't work. WestJet and Jerry Schwartz basically said enough of that. Doesn't make any sense. So operating in Canada as a ULCC, as Flair has and as Lynx did, requires you to basically have a significant amount of differentiation in your pricing in order for you to, in fact, attract market share. And that's where, the fact that you're charging these low fares, you have to have low costs. And low cost means that you have to shave as much as you possibly can from the provision of service to your customers. Flair and Lynx have done that. You want anything on Flair, anything except for that seat, you pay. Carry-on bags, checked baggage, water, anything else, you pay. And so they keep their costs down by making sure that they get revenue. In fact, of Flair's total revenue, 40% of their revenue is not by selling a seat. 40% of the revenue is selling all of those ancillary pieces of stuff that they offer you to buy when you buy your Flair ticket. So the industry, the ULCC market in Canada is characterized, yes, by low fares, but low costs. And if you want to buy stuff that you need to have, you will pay for it. And the traditional carriers have reacted to that. For the longest time, I was surprised that Air Canada and WestJet were not really doing direct competition. They let Flair and Lynx go. And in the summer of 2023, as an example, my favorite perspective is that I look at what happened in the summer of 2023. Flyers in Canada had the lowest fares in decades. You could fly from Montreal to Vancouver for $100. Never seen that fare before. Never. In my 50 years in industry, that's probably as low as it's ever been because you had Flair and Lynx going after each other. In the fall of 2023, Air Canada and WestJet said, enough. Enough of that. We're jumping in. And they dropped their fares to closely match Flair and Lynx. And the result was Lynx deciding to pack it in. So right now, Flair is back up again. So ULCCs have a tattered history. And my concern is that, are they financially secure? Have they got enough money to basically go through this battle they're going to have with a duopoly in Canada?
Right. Professor Moore, yeah, I think you want to jump in on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I remember I visited WestJet a number of times to interview the CEO, and they have a set of plaques in the hall there, which are airlines that have gone bankrupt. And there's dozens of them. If you go on Wikipedia, you can see that. And what it's saying to WestJet is that this is a hard world. Canada is a hard country to make money in as a lower cost airline, particularly. And part of it is that part of the lower cost model is to go secondary airports. Now they're doing that from Hamilton and from Abbotsford. But with Canada's geography and the population centers of Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, it's harder to do compared to the US, where Southwest has done well by infrequent flights from second-tier airports, just hard to do in our country. Mm-hmm. So, but part of that is the amount of fees you pay, because you might charge $10 a seat, but then all the other fees really add on top of that, where it becomes more expensive than the US. So there's some things that the Canadian government, broadly speaking, can do about that. And that's part of what John and I was saying up in Parliament last week, that there is a role there for the government to step up to the plate in a way they do in the US, Australia, Europe, and indeed much of the world.
Right. So let me ask you a question. So, or flip the script a little bit here. I was going to say that if anyone's watching live and has questions and they want to send them in to us, they can do so at aoc@mcgill.ca. And I normally reserve the second half of the webcast for questions, but we did receive a few in advance, and one that's come in, and let me put that to you, Professor Moore, because I think it speaks to exactly what you said. So this comes in from Christine Leveillé. So she writes that when she last traveled, she looked at the portion of the price of the ticket that was allocated to the airline versus the portion for what was called government tax, and saw that 50% of the ticket is going to tax. So her question is, how can airlines make any money if the government is inflating the ticket price from the start? And is this why airlines have to find other sources of income or offer a lesser quality service? So I guess to build off of her question, and thank you, Christine, for sending that in, is that really tax in the traditional way we think of sales tax, or is this tax to run the airports and the border agents? And is the government charging, and the airport authorities charging airlines too much?
Well, they're charging Canadians too much. So I'm taking students, we're looking at going to Kenya next year, a bunch of students and alumni on our Hot Cities trip, or other places. And it was around a little over $1,000, but when you add the taxes, it's over $2,000. And what that means is that there's some reasonable part for airport fees and all that, but when we look at the other countries that we normally compare ourselves to, Derek, the US, the EU, Australia, and so on, and I talked to some friends at IATA where we could not come up with a reasonable sized country that does what Canada does. So the government is, and we look at Montreal and Toronto are both spending billions to improve. And we fly out of Montreal and Toronto a lot. So, you know, it's a good thing to do that. And I've interviewed the CEO of Deborah, who runs Pearson Airport. They're doing great things. But normally this would be a cost shared by the government or municipalities and so on. So I think that's part of the burden there, is it making it very expensive to travel. There's some things which are done in other countries by the governments or municipalities, other people like that. So I think there's a call for that to change in order to make it more accessible to people to fly. Now, it's interesting because if you go down to Plattsburgh and fly out of Plattsburgh, and I was in Plattsburgh, it's about an hour and 15 minutes drive. They have a sign there, Montreal's American Airport. And so they know who they're going after. There's 4 million people in Montreal, a couple 100,000 at best in upstate New York. And they're going, come down here. And if you live on the South Shore of Montreal, you might be faster to go, if you have Nexus, to go to Plattsburgh than to go to Trudeau Airport. Mm-hmm. And so it's a real alternative. And Toronto has Buffalo. When I lived there, we go down to Buffalo sometime. And my brother lives in Abbotsford near Vancouver. And there's, you know, airports in the US right south there. So we have big population base where they have real alternative, where it's a lot cheaper, partly because of fees and the other things that go into it. So I think there's a real room for improvement there that could make it better. But there is, to John's point about weather and the size of our country and the closeness to US airports that Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver have, that are different than the US or Europe and so on. Right. So we have some unique things, but I think progress can be made.
Okay, so Professor Gradek, I had a follow-up for you, but you had put your hand up. I think you wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to, talk to, let people know that, yeah, we have huge fees, and they are preventing upstart carriers and ULCCs from offering the Southwest or the Spirit or Allegiant fares you see in the US of $29 or $39. EasyJet and our friends at Ryanair, 15 euros or 20 euros to fly for an hour and a half. Yeah, those fees, you can't do those in Canada. Can't. And the reason you can't do it is because we have a philosophy in Canada, which we accepted as Canadians, over, close to 30 years ago that the Minister of Transport and the federal parliament basically said that we're going to change our model to user pay. And what does user pay mean? User pay means that the infrastructure required to support air transportation will be paid for by the users of air transportation. So passengers will pay for the capital costs of airports, the capital associated with air navigation systems, with CATSA, and that, their source of revenue will be whatever they can basically build into their markets, in what's acceptable to market. So we had the birth of what we call airport improvement fees that have only gone one way, up.
Right.
Over the years.
And I
going
remember
up.
having to purchase a separate sort of pass or fee, and now that's actually baked into the tickets as well.
Yeah, because the government said, people, you don't want to be deceptive in terms of your pricing. Put everything into the price. When you quote a price to the passenger, it's an all-in price, including all the taxes, all the fees, and everything else. So again, by government edict, that now it's bundled into one price.
Right.
So, but those AIFs, are a major portion of the fees that are tacked on to the airfare. So if you have an airport that has low AIFs, and I look at my buddies over at Abbotsford, Abbotsford has 0 AIFs. Flair is able to sell a ticket between Abbotsford and Kelowna for $19.
Mm-hmm.
$19.
Wow.
And that works. It works for Flair. Now, try that anywhere else in Canada. Your AIF at $40, $35, $40, $45, can't do it. So AIFs in shorter haul routes basically are a key detractor of getting these carriers to operate in those markets.
Now, Professor Moore, you mentioned on a couple of occasions the Duluth family and Porter Airlines, and I know they've gone through quite a large expansion in the last short while, including the purchase of a new fleet of Embraer jets that's now allowing it to expand into Western Canada and compete more directly with Air Canada and WestJet on longer routes outside of the traditional Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto corridor. Do you expect this to have any impact on pricing or the competitive landscape in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, it's something where Porter's original market was out of Billy Bishop Airport, the Island Airport in Toronto. And when I go typically to Toronto, I fly in the Island Airport because I want to be downtown for people on the sea. So now it's a moving sidewalk. You get a free shuttle to the Royal York, and I'm right where I want to be, as opposed to being in an airport like Pearson waiting for a taxi, and you never know it's going to be an hour or 45 minutes, going to cost you $100. So they now have a train that goes from Pearson to Union Station, but not many people know about that. So Porter had that. They also had better service, typically. And Bob Duluth, who founded it, had a airline in Northern Ontario, so he had a fair bit of airline experience. But what they've done now is they've got Embraer planes which won't fly into the Island Airport. They can't land there. Not unlike the C Series back in the day when it was first coming out. And so they're flying out of Pearson. So what they're going to do is a great new plane, which flies well, which has only 2 seats on each side, so there's no one stuck in the middle. They're going to have the port of service that they've been known for, and they're really getting into the U.S. in a bigger way, as well as across Canada. And we can expect some more maybe to warm weather destinations in Mexico and so on, the Caribbean. I've got a lot of respect for the Duluth family because they've been at it for decades and have made a lot of money at it. On the other hand, I wonder about their sanity at other times, but it's something where they have a great product. And if they step up in buying these planes, I got to believe that the Duluths know what they're doing, that they're not throwing the money into the fire, but they're doing it because they think they can compete against Air Canada and WestJet. And I think they can. I'm optimistic about their future. And I think, but going to Pearson is quite a big change for them.
Right. Okay. So Professor Gradek, I had a follow-up question for you, and it literally the same question has just come in from someone watching in our audience. So maybe I'll give the credit over to Jason Keelau, who's asking the exact same question, which is, what is stopping the government from opening up the ownership requirements to non-Canadians? Seems like a no-brainer to try and attract the likes of Ryanair, Wizz, etc. to Canada. So I was going to ask you, I know there is something called Cabotage, I believe, that prevents foreign airlines, I think in any country, from carrying passengers between 2 domestic points. So can you talk a bit about what the sort of concept of cabotage, and can you envision a day where, like Jason is asking, the government might allow, whether it's Delta or Southwest or Ryanair, to fly a Montreal-Toronto route?
I'd love to say there is light at the end of the tunnel, but not going to happen. Not in my lifetime. Maybe in yours, Derek. I don't know, depending on the government.
Why?
It's a government policy. When you negotiate a trade agreement, when you go negotiate an air agreement, what you're doing is really negotiating country to country. And so Canada is negotiating with the US, Canada is negotiating with the EU for these bilateral trade agreements involving air. And it's like Air Canada wanting to fly between London and Frankfurt. It's like Air Canada wanting to fly between Chicago and LA. Once that, if we can get the other country to kind of agree to that, maybe we'll think about allowing, Southwest to fly between Saskatoon and Thunder Bay.
Mm-hmm.
Would we allow them to fly between Montreal and Toronto? No. Would we want them to fly between Toronto and Vancouver? No. But we would allow some carriers to fly in other routes in Canada that have less risk associated, because the big risk you have with cabotage is that carriers come in and carriers go. If they don't like what they see, they don't like the prices, they don't like the weather, they don't like the taxes, goodbye. They're gone. So there's no ownership, there's no stake in the ground that's being put by carriers traditionally operating cabotage routes. And very few examples of cabotage in the world, but there are fifth freedoms and sixth freedom flights that we know of that, you try to establish yourself in a third country and try to develop a market share in Canada, and you are American Airlines or your Delta or Southwest. It is not an easy task, because Air Canada is going to fight, WestJet's going to fight, and you're going to have a fight in your hands. So there's really, they have a lot other more profitable markets that they can go after than try to establish themselves in Canada. So markets, the thinness of the Canadian market will prevent cabotage from happening.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Jason, we tried. Thanks for the question. Another question, since we're talking about airlines specifically, I'll go to this question now, and I'll put it to you, Professor Moore, if you'd like. It comes from Suzanne Belson. She says, no mention yet of Air Transat. How do they fit into the picture?
Well, I mean, Air Transat is Air Canada almost bought them a couple years ago, so it's an entertaining thing. They are, a player more to sun destinations is a big thing of what they do, and they're going to Europe and so on. And a lower cost carrier, I flew them recently, and it wasn't a great experience, but that's probably just, a few flights. It's not enough data to say. So Air Transat is a reasonably big player, not as big as WestJet or Air Canada, but does bring some variety to the marketplace, but has positioned itself a bit different than Air Canada or WestJet. So I think they do add some value for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let me ask this next question. I'll put it to both of you. The big question on price before we move on to some other topics. Do either of you have any tips for those of us who are watching now about how to save money on airfare? Are there any secret recipes, like book on a Tuesday morning, or I don't know, any advice that one can offer to someone trying to save some money on airfare?
Yeah, I'll try that one, Karl. It's strange. The world has changed. The world of pricing in the airline industry has changed significantly over the last decade. It used to be that, the airlines would in fact have sales way ahead of time of your departure. And my advice would be book as early as you can, because the closer in you are to travel, the higher the price is going to be. And that worked for a number of years, that, the airlines would start putting sales on in January and February for travel to Europe in July and August. And the closer you got to July and August, the higher their fare would be. Well, guess what happened during COVID? People's buying behavior changed. The airlines introduced a whole bunch of new technologies, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, into the way we buy tickets. So they have got data. The airlines have got data. If you go on the website, they know when you're going to buy a ticket, and they know that you're shopping, and they know how much of a price is it going to take for you to buy. So it's called dynamic pricing. And dynamic pricing is very much part of today's buying process. Carriers, in fact, will look, if you look at a flight and you're looking at the flight, a week from now, and you look at it this afternoon, you get one price. Look at it tonight, same flight, same day, you'll get another price. Look at it tomorrow, you'll get a different price. The prices are dynamic. They keep changing depending on demand and your personal buying behavior. And so my advice to passengers is, if you're going to go look at a website, don't use your own personal address. Use an anonymous VPN, and people hopefully know what that is. But go in there anonymously so they don't know who you are, and they can't track you. And they will give you the best price possible, and also book closer in. You book now for Europe. You try to get a seat today, anywhere on the North Atlantic from Canada to Europe in the month of July. Good luck. It's sold out. And so the airlines are saying, well, maybe you can go in June, maybe you can go in September. But, get in July and August, you will pay through the nose to get on the North Atlantic. And so, but shop closer in, the airlines will start panicking. They will have 5, 10, 15 empty seats. So, but my advice, anonymous buying, shop close in, but be ready to be very flexible in terms of your travel packages.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that great advice. So we got another question that's come in from Diana Ross. I know she's a regular watcher. Can I answer this one? I know it. The question is, what is ULCC? And that is ultra low cost carrier, Diana. So that is, you mentioned the example of Flair. I guess Southwest Airlines initially was the first real famous model of an ultra low cost carrier. Although lately, I guess they've just become like any other commercial airline in the United States, correct?
No, they're still playing the low fare market, and ULCCs, have been around a long time. It's not a new phenomenon. They just get a different label. We call them discount carriers. We call them, occasional carriers. So ULCC is the current name that the world has given these types of carriers, and they're and I don't necessarily like that label because it says it's an ultra low cost carrier. They're not necessarily low cost. They are low fare. They're ultra low fare carriers. And so cost structure could be different. And you look at WestJet today, you consider WestJet a ULCC? Absolutely not. But what they do have on every one of those 180 airplanes that WestJet flies, they will allocate 50 seats on those airplanes in a low fare category that competes with Flair. So they're basically saying, we're not a low cost carrier, but we will offer you low fares. So, the model is changing. It's very dynamic, and carriers are changing their strategy.
It's interesting, Derek. One of the strategies in the past was to charge for everything, but we see Air Canada and WestJet saying, oh, you want a aisle seat, we're going to pay more for that. Oh, you want a meal, you're going to pay more for that. So there's some of the things that used to be, those tactics are now, and John made the point that one of the biggest part of the revenue of one of the ultra low cost carriers here, Flair, is that extra. What seat do you want? Do you want luggage and so on? So Air Canada, WestJet, the more traditional players have adopted a similar approach. But I remember Sir Freddie Laker. So these names are going back a long time, that the low cost models that were in Europe, but also in Canada. So it's an evolving phenomenon, as John points out.
Professor Moore, I know you're also a business professor in addition to an aviation expert. Question for you, I guess, are airlines still making money? Or is it sort of varies by company?
It varies by company. Some are very profitable, and some big bonuses paid at Air Canada to the executives. So this was a bit of a controversial thing. One is that it depends how you came out of COVID, and the Canada did not provide much support for the airlines during COVID. It fell off a cliff. Other parts of the world did provide more support. Some of the airlines like Delta are pretty profitable. So some are quite profitable. Air Canada goes up and down. We don't know about WestJet or Porter because they're privately held. So they don't have to tell the world what they're doing in terms of how much money they're making. But there's some industries, some airlines which are profitable, but most lose, many lose money. It's not a great financial game to be in these days.
Right. So I have a whole bunch more questions, but we're starting to get quite a few coming in from our audience. Again, the email address is aoc@mcgill.ca. So let me turn to a couple more of those. Professor Gradek, I'll put the next one to you. I mean, we've sort of talked about this, but this one comes in from Norman Bailey David. He wants to know if you have any recommendations on how we could introduce greater and more sustainable competition in Canada. And would this put even greater pressure on reducing costs.
Yeah. Yeah, the question is a very valid question, very good question. In my opinion, before to establish a low cost or a new carrier in Canada, however you want to call yourself, you have to pass a number of hoops with Transport Canada, with the regulator, and one is cash. How much cash do you have on hand? How much working capital do you have in order for you to basically get consideration for a license? The traditional method that is used to issue an AOC, an airport operating license in Canada, is you need 90 days of cash. 90 days of cash in the bank, working capital, that allows you to, in fact, go through the introduction of your services. Today, woefully inadequate. That, you can get an airline can start with 20 or 25 million bucks in the bank, and that money is gone within the space of a month. And now what do you do? And so my view is that if you're going to go and look at licensing new carriers, put some conditions in place that allow these guys to walk into the business with cash that allows them to, in fact, go through what I would call the doldrums of your seasonality. Planes are full in Canada, June, July, and August. Full. And it does, and I would even say it doesn't matter how much you charge. People want to fly, they want to fly in the summer, and the planes are full. The question is, can you survive from September through May? And that's when the doldrums happen, where you can throw all kinds of crazy fares out there and you won't fill the airplane up. So airlines have to have enough working capital in order for them to support 12 months worth of operation. And I think that, to me, is a key driver of competitive survival in Canada. And the other one, of course, is regulatory oversight. We have, I've been slapped on the wrist many times by the regulators and by critics that we have predatory pricing in Canada. Mm-hmm. We do have action taken by the duopoly, whether it's Air Canada or WestJet, that they very much take action to go after the LCCs or ULCCs or a new competitor. It could even be Porter. So we have to somehow, some way, provide some commercial action, commercial oversight to, in fact, manage and slap that behavior down. And right now, the Competition Bureau not doing it, Transport Canada not doing it, and the carriers, and Stephen Jones, the president of Flair, very vocal, saying that, wait a second, we're not in a level playing field here, and we are going to get tackled by the duopoly.
Wow. Sounds like this webcast could have been sponsored by Via Rail. Professor Moore.
But to your point, Via Rail basically gets subsidized. Do you know today, on a passenger traveling on a train from Montreal to Moncton, gets subsidized by $360? Does that happen in air? Not a chance. There's not a user pay model for rail. There is no user pay model for roads, for trucks, for cars. There's no such. The only place we have a user pay model in transportation in Canada is air. Why is that?
Right.
We used to Morocco riding their trains over there. And Moroccan students are giving me a hard time about Canadian trains. Great trains, they just go so slow. And in Europe, a lot, like France has said, if there's a train that's 2 hours long, you can't fly. So in some ways, but it would be costing $40-50 billion to make Toronto-Montreal rail reasonable. It's something that we should be doing, but it's just a huge bill in order to do that. Now, I'd heard that in Quebec, some smaller cities are getting some subsidy, or the airlines are, to fly some remote parts of Quebec. And other parts of the country are thinking about that as well, just because these small towns really do need service.
Okay, so that is a great segue into another question, and let's try to get through so many questions that come in. We'll try to get through as quickly as we can, but I'll stick with you on that one, Professor Moore. Question from Terry Baxter. She writes, hi, I live in Kingston, Ontario, and we have not had flight service since Air Canada pulled flights during COVID. How can we get an airline to service a city of over 125,000 people? We shouldn't have to drive to Toronto to fly to Sault Ste. Marie.
Well, it's a tough thing because the businesses are looking at it and going, how many people fly Where are they going? So IATA provides that data. So I know the CEO of Montreal Airport would look at the data and say there's a lot of people flying from Montreal to Toronto, then on to Milan. We should have a direct Montreal-Milan flight. So goes to the Italian Airlines and says, let's do this. So that's what airports do, is try to persuade airlines to fly to the airport because it gets revenue for them and more passengers, but shows them the data. So part of it is how many people are going from Kingston are driving to Toronto or Montreal or Ottawa and then flying on somewhere. And you go, there's 100 people a day. Well, that can convince an airline to put a flight in. But also Kingston is this, do we have the fleet to do it is a question you have as well. Do you have the right size of plane? And occasionally when I fly from Toronto to Montreal, it's in a 787 or something, and it's just a flight that came in from Portugal or something, and they had a big plane. So they used it to do that onward flight and then from Montreal to Europe or something. But it's a matter, do you have the right fleet? Is there demand that is going to be year-round largely? To John's point, it's going to be slower in some parts of the year. So it's possible, but it's got to show us the facts. It's kind of what the airlines are looking for. And you got to persuade them that there's a real reason. Now, I've talked to the airport manager in Abbotsford, and he's done a good job of going out there and talking to airlines and pitching what they can do at Abbotsford and pitching the volume of business, and then proving that he's right over time as well. All right. So this is a strategy that the smaller towns can use. And you might try to get government support to some degree, like in Newfoundland, talking to the member of parliament there from Gander, more flights to Gander would help the economy, and you'd get more tourism and so on. So some arguments could be made there that it helps the business side very much, both tourism as well as business organizations.
Okay, really good advice and tips there. Professor Gradek, I'll put the next question to you. This one came in advance from Barry Mulholland. He says he's had 3 flights canceled this year, all with Air Canada. Are the airlines canceling these flights in order to force people onto other less popular flights in order to keep their other planes full?
Good question. So airlines publish schedules months ahead of time, and the summer schedule for summer 24 was published in the fall of 2023. Right now, they're publishing the winter schedule for 24-25. So the airlines publish their schedules months ahead of time, and they're aspirational. They're not really looking to fly those flights. So they put those flights out there so that people can, in fact, pick and choose the flight and pay the prices that they're looking at. When it gets closer into operational day of flight, there is a necessity to go and look at which airplanes are we going to fly? Which flights do we have? Because we don't have the crews, we don't have the flight attendants, we haven't got the parking, we haven't got the slots to fly what we thought we were going to want to fly. So let's pick and choose the flights we're going to operate. And therefore, you have this consolidation that takes place. And it's not just cancellations. What really bothers me is change of gauge. You sell an airplane that's a 777 flying from Montreal to Vancouver, and guess what? You're going to end up flying on an A220. At 200 less seats and no lie flats, no business class, no premium economy. And so the airlines are not only canceling, but they also are changing gauge, changing the product, changing the service that they've sold passengers in the first place. And that is peeving off Canadian passengers.
Okay, so let me go to this next question. It's sort of, she says question/comment from Sophie Brosseau here at McGill. She says, I understand that airlines are short-staffed like most other industries, but why does it feel like the customer is no longer a priority for them? They cancel flights, change the schedule, and mostly don't inform customers of the situation. Most of the time, we're left in the dark with no explanation and no support. More comment than question, I guess.
Karl, you want to try that one?
John, I think you have the down-to-earth experience with that.
Oh yeah, no, it's nasty out there. It's nasty. Yeah, you're right. The staffing and the price that people, and the salary costs, is starting to climb. We've seen pilots at WestJet get significant increases. Air Canada's pilots are currently negotiating wage increases in the range of 40 to 50%. I'm not sure they're going to get it, but they're going to get some significant bumps. There are a number of labor groups in the Canadian workforce, and Air Transat just went through the flight attendants. Flight attendants rejected the contract offered by Transat 3 times. before they finally got what they thought was be a pretty good deal. So labor rates are going to come up. But you're right, passenger agents, flight attendants, totally exasperated. They are working to the bone. There's a lot more work to be done, and the staffing levels are keep changing. People join airlines and quit within 6 months because it's not a place you want to work, and the wages are not there. So there's a big gap to fill between expectations and what you're actually getting to do.
Right. All right. So we got about 10 minutes to go, a bit less, and a whole bunch more questions. I'll try to sort of get through as many as I can. Here's one from Monica Johnstone. Can the professor speak to the aggressive fuel surcharges on international tickets? Base fares are sometimes 25 to 30% of the overall cost of the ticket. We haven't actually spoken about the price of jet fuel, but how much of an impact is that having?
It's not jet fuel.
Oh.
They call it jet fuel. It's called surcharges.
Oh.
and surcharge. And it used to be based on fuel. It used to be based on fuel. And the price of fuel went up 15% because there was an embargo or a geopolitical war that happens, and the price of fuel jumps up 30 bucks a barrel. Yeah, there's a fuel surcharge. But the war is over, the geopolitical tension comes down, price of oil comes down. What happens to your fuel surcharge? Oh, it's still there. Oh, that's nice. Nobody's complaining about it. Nobody said anything about it. So they changed the name from fuel surcharges to just basically surcharge. And that's the big bugaboo that, Karl's ticket, that he did he's trying to get to Africa. Yeah, 1,300 base fare, 2,300, all in. A good portion of that, Karl, is what they call this mysterious surcharge. 600 bucks, 500, 600 bucks. Nobody knows. Nobody's asking any questions because that's what the airline's prerogative is, to charge what they think would be the price in the marketplace. So yeah.
So here's an interesting follow-up question. This one came to us from Bill Lynham. He's saying, flipping the question around, what would be the necessary increase in cost to get the skies friendly again in Canada?
Oh, man.
We're paying because that's what it costs?
Put the genie back in the bottle. Good luck. Canadians
business class is friendlier.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Costs you a bundle. Costs you a bundle,
Yeah,
Karl.
Yeah.
But
the next to Professor Moore, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, but the issue is Canadians have accepted the lower standard of service. When we have the president of Air Canada make a statement in one of his quarterly releases, I think it was last fall, saying, "Oh, we got a 70% on-time performance. Good enough. We're not going to spend too much more money trying to fix that up." And I'm saying, wait a second. Since when is 70% on time acceptable? My buddies at Delta are hitting 89, 90%, and it's saying it's still not enough. Mm-hmm. So I think we've reached a level of complacency in customer service in Canada where Canadians have come to accept lousy service. And so be it. That's the price we have to pay for air travel in Canada.
Professor Gradek, I've never seen you so animated or so angry. I love it. Professor Moore, I'll put the next question to you from Jeanette Belrose. She says, do you think 9/11 had a significant impact on the industry? Having traveled for business since the mid-'80s, my experience is that the problem started after 9/11, way before the pandemic.
I'm not sure I would. Part of it was security, for sure. Where, security after 9/11, and it was not an unreasonable response. Now, I have Nexus, and I would recommend everybody get Nexus. It's something like $10 a year. But when you go to the airport, there's one or two people ahead of me when I go through there. And I don't have to put my laptop out and stuff like that. So you're a trusted traveler. So it's worth the effort. And I've had it for 10 or 15 years. So I just sign up again every 5 years. My son has it as well, and it makes travel a lot easier to get through there. But certainly all that added security happened was 9/11, and we're more suspicious of people, which would apply to everyone, which is fair enough. You can't just be suspicious of certain groups, but that, and I'll tell you a story. Many years ago, I was flying to London, England, out of Toronto, and I got on a small plane, and I said to the flight attendant, "I can't believe this plane's flying across the Atlantic." She said, "You're flying to London, Ontario." But this is, long before security and all that sort of thing. Everybody laughed as I was I'm glad I asked the question, because it'd been very embarrassing after an hour flight to end up in London. So, and I remember when I went to college, Derek, many years ago. My mother came on the plane and fastened my seatbelt.
Oh gosh.
These are clearly old stories. So 9/11 did impact us from a security viewpoint. I think COVID might have had a bigger impact on the industry in other ways, though.
All right. So, Professor Gradek, I'll put this one to you. I think we have time for maybe two more questions, and I have I have one I'm going to save for the end because it's positive. This one comes from Michael Chetner, a bit niche, but I guess he's out in Alberta, so we'll put this to you. He says Air Canada pulled out of Calgary as a hub and no longer flies routes to Japan and the EU from Calgary. Now WestJet has taken over these routes, and WestJet has removed routes out of YYZ. I think that's Pearson, right?
Oh.
Similarly, he's looking for some sort of comment.
Oh yeah, there is rationalization happening in Canada. Carriers are basically focusing their attention on markets that they want to build a fortress around. WestJet has chosen Fortress Calgary. Air Canada has chosen Fortress Montreal, Toronto. Vancouver, they're still trying to figure out how to do Vancouver. But yeah, Calgary is Fortress WestJet. They basically, and I keep having arguments with the executives of WestJet about how you've abandoned the Maritimes, how you've abandoned Quebec. And they haven't. They said, no, we're flying St. John's, Calgary. We're flying Halifax, Calgary. We're flying Montreal, Calgary. We're even flying Quebec, Calgary. But you're flying Calgary. Not the world doesn't revolve around Calgary. And maybe for you it does, but Canadians don't necessarily want to fly from St. John's to Calgary to get to Winnipeg. And so we've got there's some rationalization going on, and is it collusion? I don't know. The Competition Bureau doesn't think so far. But there is some work being done amongst the carriers unofficially to kind of say, okay, you want to build Calgary, we'll stay away, WestJet, and if we'll stay away out of Toronto, Montreal.
So we got two more. We'll get two more questions, and I love this question.
Two more. Oh,
I'll put it to you, Professor Moore. I mean, I love the simplicity of this question. It comes from Catherine Daguayar. Why are flights always delayed? Always in all caps.
Well, that's overstating it, but not by much. Now, part of it is winter, so that weather is a legitimate part. But it's also that the airports and the airlines have both dropped the balls at times, where they're not, acting up to the standards that we see in the U.S. Though when you go through Chicago and New York, you tend to be late. So the big airports with lots of traffic, they schedule it too much. And the weather can throw that off, and that's not entirely illegitimate. It's also there are not enough trained people at times as well at some of the big airports and on the planes as well. So it's the airports and the airlines that are somewhat to blame. Part of it is somewhat just the nature of the airline industry and of Canada, but they can improve without a question.
Okay. Wonderful, I guess. So let's put this we'll put the last question to you, Professor Gradek, and I saved it for the end because, like I said, it's always nice to end on a positive note. This one comes from Lucy Yetz, and she's asking, what are some of the positive trends or opportunities with respect to customer service in the aviation sector? Things have to be improving a little bit, aren't they not?
It's not getting any worse. It can't get any worse, in my opinion. Yeah, but it's getting better. I think Air Canada is doing a whole bunch of things to try to improve the in-flight environment on board the airplanes. They're introducing bus services to complement their airport services. So they're trying desperately to kind of shore up the image that they have. Is it enough? No. But the question is going to be one. Air Canada has a focus on economics, on profitability. That's what they're looking for. They want to give return back to the shareholder. So if customer service has to take a back seat, it is very natural that takes a back seat to profitability. And I use that as a parallel to my friends at Boeing. When the Boeing's problems going on, profitability is taking the front seat to engineering, quality, and safety. Same thing's happening in the airline industry. Some airlines have focused on service and gotten profitable. Air Canada's focused on profitability. Unfortunately, service is not there.
Wow. And I had a whole bunch of questions about Boeing in and of itself, but we'll have to save those for another time. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. but thank you both. This was a lot of fun, actually. Before we bring this webcast in for a smooth landing, I would like to remind you that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends, so feel free to share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. I would, of course, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our two guests, Professors Karl Moore and John Gradek, for joining me today to discuss a topic that I know, based on the questions we're getting, is on the minds of so many people these days. And thank you once again to our worldwide audience of McGill alumni and friends for tuning in today. And please continue to stay tuned to your McGill email and social media feeds for more updates on exciting online and in-person programming. In fact, I'll be back here for our next McGill News Webcast on Tuesday, June 11th, when we look at how new advances in genetics here at McGill and elsewhere are upending the way we think about and treat illness and disease. So until then, please be well. And if you are heading off to an airport anytime soon, good luck and safe travels. And thank you.
Thank you, Derek.
Take care, everybody.